Social value is about providing meaningful and lasting relationships between businesses and the local communities in which they operate.
So that might be from the green spaces that we're providing, to thinking about workplace design, to air quality, and also just simple things about how we're collecting waste and keeping our streets nice and clean.
It's like chocolate in chocolate cake. It's an integral part of any successful project, and it's about the positive benefits a project brings over and above built form, so the social, the environmental and the economic.
A lot of the projects that we work on, we do a lot of research into who our demographic is, and think very carefully about how do they live and how can we enhance their lifestyle.
Some of the challenges around social value that I found have been there being a lack of universally adopted measurement system, and therefore that makes communicating social value a challenge in terms of reporting to stakeholders.
The issue that I think we see with the framework is a lot of it is very driven by inputs. So for example, how many hours of community engagement might come about as a result of this contract. But the reality is it's not the number of hours that goes in that matters. What matters are the results that come out of that community engagement.
I think the challenges are deeper than tangible barriers. I think it's more about adapting mindsets. So the backgrounds of people leading on the investment, the design and curation of spaces can be starkly different to the future users.
One of the biggest challenges is what I see as the tension between putting people first or putting profit first. And as a charity, we're always about putting people first, and we also think very, very long term. So what we spend and have spent in the past on housing eventually recoups itself, because we think in terms of hundreds of years. Now I contrast that with the more short-term pressures on developers to generate profit, satisfying shareholders, and I just wonder, how you put the people at the centre of that process.
Social value really does put people and communities at the heart of decision making. All we have to do is open our eyes and see across London the amazing transformational changes we're seeing that brings people into buildings and places and spaces where ordinarily they hadn't been included before. I am very passionate about this, and so to be looking at how we can create more places and spaces across the city for people to be included is the kind of change we need to make for the better.
So, first of all, thank you everyone for coming to this session today. As you can see, it's called Design Matters, Exploring Social Value. As you heard from myself from the VT, just saying it's something I'm very, very passionate about. My background is not real estate. I came into real estate about 8 years ago, coming from a youth and voluntary sector background, and pretty much found very quickly that the real estate industry and sector is connected to every single part of our lives. And so coming into the sector, I was able to actually find and discover that by working closely with developers, architects, planners, we were able to create the kind of social outcomes I was always striving to achieve in my charity days. I think it's really important to understand that, because I think the word value has been something that's been used in many different contexts over many, many years. And I think what we have today is esteemed panelists here who are going to introduce themselves now, and we will then talk about value.
As Debbie Akers, I'm Chief Executive of the Central District Alliance and Hatton Garden Bids. My background is in economic regeneration, property, and a few years in criminal justice, and now back into the world of bids.
My name is Gary McCluskey. I'm the Global Head of Design for Greystar. Architect by trade. Spent 10 years doing social housing, 10 years doing for sale housing, and 10 years doing rental housing, so quite a broad range of experience. And I oversee all the projects that we're doing in 17 countries and 240 cities. So.
My name's Imogen Clark. I'm one of the co-founders of a small charity called Make Space for Girls, and we're about encouraging people to make parks and recreation grounds and playing fields and all those sort of public realm areas more welcoming to teenage girls, to non-binary young people, and to the boys for whom the current provision doesn't really work. My background, bizarrely, was a lawyer, so I don't quite know, but I've left that behind now.
Hi, I'm James Miller. So best way to describe me is I'm the data guy on the panel. My background is actually originally as a retailer, so I've always worked with information about customers to sort of develop better experiences and so on. And that's what actually brought me through into real estate, was that interest in people and how they behave and how they engage with spaces. The organisation I'm from, Pragma, is a strategic advisory for developers, asset managers and so on. And we help them with their strategy about places, help them optimise those places, think about what they can do with them. And we work very closely with our sister organisation, Benoy, helping with kind of architectural practice with kind of evidence-led design and so on. So that's me.
Hi all, my name is Yemi Aladran. I'm the Head of Development at Meridian Water for Enfield Council. Meridian Water is Enfield's flagship regeneration project, which seems to deliver 10,000 homes and 6,000 jobs in the next 25 years, and my background is in architecture.
Brilliant, thank you, Yemi, and thank you to the other panellists. One of the things we're using today, because obviously we have great experts in the room, is asking questions. So if you are used to using Slido, we have the hashtag LRF23. Please submit your questions and we'll try and address as many as possible at the end of the session. I think obviously the session is really key and important to the future of real estate, especially in London. And I think one of the key understandings we want to move away from is that social value is something that costs money. It's not. It's something that's actually an investment. And when we invest in social value, we create much better places and spaces for us all to enjoy, whether you live there, whether you work there, or whether you're just visiting, or actually even if you've never thought about coming in, but you bring something forward in terms of design that makes people want to come to a destination. And so what I want to try and dive deeply into today and explore with the panel today is what we can do and what our various roles, we all have very different backgrounds in real estate, play a part in that wider agenda. And I think at the end of the session, I'd like to kind of think of this more of a call to action about what will we do when we leave this room to make sure these changes are happening, because ultimately there's no point in having these conversations if nothing changes. So Debbie, I'll start with you. We've known each other quite a while now in various different roles over the last sort of 5-6 years. And my question for you is, because I'm really intrigued by how bids work, is that, how can bids support the work you do, and what's the social value agenda underpinning that?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, I think, bids, I think we've got, 72 now across London. I think there's 320 nationally, so and growing at pace as well. And I think what a business improvement district can do is we're great conveners. We can bring people around the table. So we work really, really closely with our local authorities. I mean, I'm a firm believer that we are all businesses that operate within a community, and some of us go home at the end of the day, businesses go out, but actually there's people that still live in the area. So it's really, really important that as businesses, we're actually giving something back as well to those communities. So I'm a firm believer in that. And I think it's really important also to have a really robust ESG programme. Years ago, back when I first started all this, it was corporate responsibility and then it was corporate social responsibility. So over the years, it's had many, many different guises. And now we talk about ESG. But I think for me, the important part of that, the environmental piece, obviously, but for me, the really important bit is that social value. And actually, as businesses, how can we do that? We can bring people around the table. From my point of view, I think local authorities know their communities. So we have to, as businesses, talk to those, those local communities and the local authorities. And we bring developers, we bring real estate, and we bring our businesses, together. Because I think, again, my team get really fed up me saying this. I think, individually we do really great things, but actually working as a collective, when you come together as a partnership, you can do so much more. And I think, across London, if you look at a lot of the local authorities across London, they all have the same issues, whether it's housing, whether it's whether it's unemployment, whatever it might be, those issues are generally the same across London. But I think, in particular at CDA, we've implemented things like the Mayor's Skills Academy to address, we must not forget about our young people. So we've set up a digital academy and a hospitality academy in partnership with Capital City College Group, and our businesses are involved in them. So they can, it's about getting young people trained, it's about offering apprenticeships, and it's about then offering that employment at the end. So actually, it benefits the community, it benefits young people, and it benefits business. And I think if businesses can see the value in that, then you're all speaking the same language. And I think bids are really good at doing that, bringing people together.
And the interesting word I think you use there is language, because obviously it's a business improvement district. The word social doesn't sit anywhere around that, and I think it's quite interesting now that you're using this language and actually communicating this to your members and also to the wider stakeholders. Which is really great to hear and feel. Gary, obviously you work in a very different world to Debbie in terms of working at Greystar, and obviously one of the UK's biggest build-to-rent developers, and obviously with your mandate of operating the assets and people being involved in those assets, the social piece is quite important to you guys, I believe. So the kind of question I have for you, though, is kind of, how can real life positively inform design codes and London design guidance? Because I think one of the things we've realised is that design is what creates value, and social value in particular. And do you think technology in some way holds the key to unlocking that?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. So we've been operating, I think, for 30 years. And we have a dedicated research team who generally poll, I think we're probably around 2 million residents. They poll cohorts of those residents to gather data. And so we've been collecting data for the last sort of 30 years on what people actually want out of the housing. And it's really interesting because when you're traveling around the world, every city has kind of guidelines and regulations around housing. It's probably the most regulated property type in the world. Partly probably because there's been so many failures in the sort of 50s and 60s. And so, when we go into a new market and we come into London, we look at what are people really looking for in that market? What is housing? What is community? And part of what we're doing is we're providing a sort of a design and a management structure. And it's both of those things that go together to create community. And a lot of the guidelines focus around design. And actually, a lot of the positive benefits of sort of social value come from the management team and how they manage the community. And I think as we sort of look at things like the London Housing Design Guide, which is, it's a great document, originally sort of built around, the failures of social housing as a guidance document. And then it suddenly applied to housing which is not social housing. And so the research behind it is not really kind of relevant to types of housing outside of that research. And we tend to oversimplify things. We love to simplify ideas so that they're understandable. But in doing that, we lose the nuances. And so we have a whole bunch of data from our research that just doesn't align with the guidance. And the guidance document is great for social housing. It's great for some forms of for sale housing. But actually, from a social value perspective, there are key elements in the London Housing Design Guide that destroy the value. And that's kind of, when we started off our Greenford project back in 2016, we spent a long time with the GLA analysing that guidance, and they issued a note saying you should relax the guidance when it comes to build to rent. That note's since been removed, and so everything we learned and all the work we'd done back then has been lost, and we're now kind of facing a sort of a challenge to deliver the value that we think is important, and it's driven by how residents want to live rather than maybe someone sitting in an office and saying, this is how people should live.
And that resident engagement is probably the crucial part, obviously, is you have a lot of operational assets now, so just saying you're drawing down on that data and using that, I'm guessing, through your design practices in terms of your future schemes up and coming, which is obviously very useful, but also informative.
Yeah, and Home Views are doing a great job in the UK. They've sort of launched a few years ago. They're collecting massive amounts of data, and that data is going to be really useful going forward.
Brilliant. And I guess this obviously leads into you then, Imogen. I think one thing I will say about Imogen being on this panel is it makes me feel like I'm not unique anymore, because actually these sort of panels never had social value people on, or people that were actually focusing on specific sort of local community needs. And I think your charity, Make Space for Girls, is phenomenal in terms of how it now brings attention to an area where it's very obvious to think about it. Boys and girls play in spaces, but actually most spaces were designed for boys to play, not girls to play. So it's great to have you on the panel, Imogen. And I think from my point of view,
the question I think we have for you today is kind of like, how can we work to view sort of consultations as a positive collaboration process? Because often there hasn't seemed to be that. And the other part of that question is that it's not viewed as a kind of, reductive tick box exercise. It actually makes an impact and a difference. And, what do you think we all need to do in this room to make that shift?
Yeah, I mean, thank you. I was told I had 5 minutes for this, and because I'm a very literal person, I came up with 5 things that we could do. So the first one is about collecting post-occupancy data and trying to tie back how people enjoy and use these spaces. Are they being used as we expected them to be used? Are they being used in a different way? Is that different way good? Is that different way bad? That post-occupancy data, and then tying it back to the community consultation and engagement that's gone on, so that we can start to build up some data that can show that good consultation does end up with better outcomes in terms of the user experience of the space. And linked to that, I think, is thinking about the financial models that allow us to pay for that post-occupancy data collection, because it's just, for a lot of places, it simply isn't there. And we talk to people and say, have you got any, and no, we haven't got any money to do it. Okay, so we need to think about post-occupancy data. My second point is collaboration and people being open to sharing their experiences of what's worked well and what hasn't worked well. I think that most industries are very good at sharing their successes. I think we enjoy doing that. That's a wonderful feeling. But we learn a lot more from our failures, and actually feeling safe to collaborate across different sectors with competitors, collaborating with competitors, not in a way that's going to upset the CMA, but collaborating with competitors to say, look, we tried this. It really didn't work for us. Have you had any experience similar to that? So that we can move more quickly and we don't have people replicating the same mistakes. I think if we have those two, we come on to my third idea, which is, we can then start to create some metrics where we're not measuring community engagement in terms of hours in, we're measuring it in terms of the outcomes that we see for the spaces. And I think that will, that'll really help shift the dial. And then I have 2 other thoughts. First one, the education of young professionals who are going to enter into the built environment. Some courses have an option that you can do community engagement, and some people on the courses will take those options. But I think, it's incredibly important that all young architects, all young landscape architects, all young planners, all young urban designers, as part of their professional education, are taught about the value of community engagement, because they will then come into the industry not seeing community engagement as, oh, it's a cost, it's an add-on, I don't really understand it. They will come into the profession going, I understand the value that this can bring to the project that I'm working on because I've been taught it. So I think education, and that links on to my final point, which is being comfortable with sharing power with the local community. And, the real estate sector, it's incredibly complicated. It's dealing with very difficult problems. Creating good spaces takes a lot of expertise. So it is a field that has to have a lot of experts in it. And it's very hard for experts to share power. It's really difficult. And I think that's something that if we can find a way for all of the brilliant experts who are involved in creating our spaces to feel comfortable with ceding a bit of power to the community, then we'll start to see more value.
And thank you. That's such an insightful view, because I said that's not a view that's been widely shared in real estate over the years, and it's becoming something that's been more prominent and actually very much more common, so it's great to hear. James, obviously your role is, again, very, very different, and as you said, you're the data guy on the panel, and the word data has popped up 4 or 5 times already today, so I think you might as well go home because people are taking it over for you. No, but genuinely, I think it's really important to understand the data side of what we're doing and how we're using that to make changes and improvements. So, how can we establish, though, like a comprehensive evidence base of social value? I think that's one of the biggest issues in the sector that social value springs up, is what are we measuring, how are we quantifying it, and how do we bring that forward? And not just purely focusing on the economic outcomes of what social value can create.
Yeah, no, absolutely. This is an enormous question. And I think the spoiler alert I'll give you is I don't have an answer yet to that. But I've got ways of thinking about it. And obviously, I'm loving the fact that data gets mentioned constantly because it means I remain relevant. But data is a big problem, and fundamentally it's not actually data. We've got lots of data. It's about knowledge, it's about information, it's about how do we make better decisions about the spaces that we design, how they're used, how do we make sure that they're delivering the impact that we hope they do. So fundamentally, I always think about sort of working backwards on these things. So we're developing spaces. What's its function? What do we want it to do for us? That informs the kind of analytics, the kind of data that we need. So we don't really start with the data. We're kind of looking for that evidence to support us. I mean, what I've seen over the years, much to my gratification, obviously, is as a data person, is there's lots of information out there, and on the quantitative side of life, when it certainly comes around, thinking about people and how they use spaces, people like me are in a sweet shop at the moment in the sense that we've got things like consumer footfall data from mobile phone technology, which tells us things like the sort of people that are in places, how long they're there for, how frequent they use it. But it only gets us so far. It gives us a base. It doesn't tell us anything about how they feel about those places, what it's actually doing for them. So when it comes to things like well-being or social inclusion and so on, you don't get that from the quantitative side particularly. And for me, actually, it's what we're wrestling with. And what we do all the time at Pragma, actually, is we ask people questions, okay? And it might seem a little bit old school. It's the kind of the qualitative research is making an enormous resurgence. So what I've seen in years is that kind of the quantitative side and AI is becoming more important in terms of helping us make connections about big insights about the way people use spaces. But there's a really important aspect to this. It's actually going out and talking to people and finding out what they want for spaces, how are they using them, are they feeling alienated about those spaces, whatever it might be. So all of our projects, and in the UK and right across the world, most of them are things that are getting built. So suburbs and cities, big assets, airports, you name it, all sorts of things. What we do a lot of is actually, surveying, really getting, we can talk to masses of sort of numbers of people in terms of surveying. And the great thing about that is that that's a lot cheaper these days. It used to be very, very different and expensive. But I think we really excel. What we really have to do is those kind of detailed interviews with people. And you don't actually need to speak to too many people to get a sense of what they feel about the space on the qualitative side. I would say you actually get some very profound insights from going out and speaking to people. Now, from a data perspective, what you find is our job then is to reduce the bias that comes from all of that. So it's about actually going out and speaking to a diverse group of people. And that's our job, to manage that kind of bias. And obviously it's subjective. So people take different forms of value from the same space. They have different reasons for being there. And we kind of need to get to that. So to kind of answer the question about economic measures, they have their place. So you look at things like Social Value Portal, who are an organisation which, I admire the way they've kind of created their measurement framework. We talk about social impact in terms of financial proxies, and there's a good reason for that, because it's a lingua franca we all understand, and we can start to compare things. But we do need to go beyond it, and that's where the qualitative side comes in.
Yeah, excellent. I mean, one of the things that I've struggled with in this space for the last 8 years is the whole approach to measurement. And I came up with a bit of an analogy the other day. People don't know me, I love analogies. And the analogy I have is on a theme park. So you go to a theme park and you sort of see the ride has a 1.2 metre height restriction. If you saw a 5-year-old child walking up to it, you wouldn't need to measure that child to know it's not going to be tall enough. But we do know what things do need to be measured. And I think the problem we have at the moment is we're trying to measure everything. Yeah. And as you've said there, actually look at that sort of 5-year-old child in that analogy and think, but what value are they adding, and where can we grow that value to make sure it's a point where we can measure it at the right time? And I think that's where we've been in a bit of a rush with social value. Agreed. To not fully understand that. And I think that kind of nicely sort of segues into the point of why measurement sometimes is so key, is because obviously local authorities are doing a lot of work in terms of procurement and benchmarking, and social value is now a big part of that in terms of being 10% of the scoring metrics and methodologies. Yeah. And so Yemi, this obviously then falls to you, obviously being a local authority voice on the panel. So my question to you is, how does stewardship impact on social value success, and how important is the long-term monitoring of that? Because that's where I think a lot of measurement frameworks come from, is to make sure we monitor these things and sustain the kind of value they're adding to the work we're doing.
Yeah.
Great question. The central focus for local authorities is the well-being of the people that they serve. Long-term stewardship involves policies and initiatives that enhance the quality of life, economic and environmental opportunities, and social equity, not only in the present time, but also in the future. Given the significant resources, the budgets, the contracts, the public assets that local authorities control, we need to continue to use those resources to strategically support initiatives that generate social value. Our decisions and policies have a profound impact on society, and we can shape those to encourage our supply chains to contribute positively towards our social, economic, and environmental goals. To re-emphasize, local authorities have the power to turn policies into progress and regulation into tangible impact through the mandate of social value. Procurement processes are one of the most powerful tools we have at our disposal to demand, not sheepishly ask, but demand for commitments to ethical and sustainable practices. We must make it clear that social value is not optional. It's not simply a nice to have or a favor you're doing to the client. It's an obligation. Procurement is a route through to achieving social value, but it's not the end of the process. Good design in relation to social value is not merely about aesthetics or functionality, as we've talked about. Through thoughtful and purposeful design, we can create solutions that empower individuals, improve their quality of life, foster a sense of belonging, and really uplift underserved communities. Measuring and long-term monitoring of the social impacts of inclusive design is a challenge that requires collaboration, innovation, and commitment. We must employ a multifaceted approach that goes beyond just traditional metrics. So surveys and feedbacks from the very people that are impacted by the design will provide valuable insights, comparative studies, aid in setting a benchmark of excellence. Quantitative data, such as access rates and participation levels, will help us gauge the reach and effectiveness of our initiatives. And in-depth case studies will unveil real-world successes and challenges, guiding us towards continuous improvement. Collection of data, also in its many forms, assists in assessing the effectiveness of social value initiatives and in directing future decision-making processes. The very nature of what we do as local authorities means that we have to care about how the people who are living, working, and traveling through the places and spaces that we're creating feel. Happy, healthy people and communities drive value, not only ethically and in terms of placemaking, but also financially. So initiatives that support well-being can lead to cost savings in various ways, including reducing the demand for emergency social services and increasing residents' self-sufficiency. We need to shift social value from being simply transactional to transformative. And this requires a change in mindset and commitment to broader long-term goals. We need to focus on purpose and remembering that the key thread of all of this is people and ensuring that the widest range of people are involved in all stages of the process. Having diverse voices involved in social value initiatives is crucial for representative insights, for avoiding bias, for innovation and creativity, for effective problem solving, for legitimacy and trust, adaptability. I could go on and on and on. I think in the context housing, which is my particular area of focus, in our time, and in the backdrop of the horror that is Grenfell Towers, where 72 people, mainly from Black and minority ethnic and working class backgrounds, died, and in the backdrop of little Awad Ishaq, who at the tender age of 2 years old lost his life to the mold that made his home unsafe, and those are just two examples. The importance of social value and remembering that behind every number is a person, behind every metric is a person. Therefore, we must collaborate, i.e. designing, authoring, making, governing with the widest demographic of people. And that should be central to everything that we're doing. Because when all the winning is done, the winning of work, the winning of awards, what remains are the spaces and the buildings that inhabit our skylines. They will have an environmental and physical impact, yes, but also massive social impacts. The hope is that in coming together in genuine collaboration with the widest demographic of people, we will positively impact the communities that we're designing for, and in turn, those communities, our communities, and eventually history, despite our collective failures, may still be able to remember all of our efforts kindly. Thank you.
Thank you, yes. Thank you, that was actually quite really inspiring, and I've just sort of written down so many things to unpack from that. One of the things that really stands out for me is your reference to the sort of social inequality part, and actually it does feel by what you're saying, and I think what everyone's saying on the panel today, that sort of social value really is that remedy to some of the social inequalities that we actually, let's be honest, we cause some negative impacts for real estate, and I think it's that positive acceptance of that's what we can do. It's not just about putting a load of houses somewhere and it having positive impacts on everybody who's going to live in those houses. There's normally existing a wider community that's already there, and that's how we blend in, the more commercially driven and kind of, policy-driven aspirations around housing with those existing needs and those existing issues and challenges, and also how can the future development be the thing that basically resolves and supports those. Another thing you mentioned there, which I found really interesting, it goes back to your point as well, Imogen, is the stewardship point around data collection, because data collection isn't necessarily free, it's not cheap. So who would you see, Yemi, in terms of what you've just said there about data collection and the monitoring part, being responsible for that? Is it a local authority responsibility? Is it the developer responsibility? Because developers at some point will exit the opportunity they're working on. So in terms of that long-term stewardship, where do you see that coming?
I absolutely see the local authorities and housing associations, those that have the long-term stake in the homes and places that we're developing. I see us as having to set the pace and having to be those that connect all the dots together and push for the change that we want to see. So, for example, at Meridian Water, what we've done in the first phase of the development, yes, through procurement, ensuring that we get the social value requirements that we expect, but then every month we are meeting very positively with our developers to monitor those against the targets and against the KPIs. And the point is that it's not only to monitor to say, oh, you're not meeting X, Y, and Z, but actually, how can we help you? Because by helping you, we're helping ourselves. So really then tapping into all our existing networks as well to come together to ensure, for example, we also have a skills academy, ensuring that we're getting the number of apprenticeships that we want through. And also as a project working wider within the council and our colleagues in the council, all the different departments, and ensuring we're not working in silos and reaching out to as many people as possible to ensure that we are achieving the goals that we've set.
Yeah, thank you. And I think taking it back to another point you made and taking it back into the design element of this conversation panel today is that, what is the role of design in creating positive social value? Is it pushed forward enough? Is it maybe overbearing sometimes in the conversation? Gary, obviously as an architect working for a build-to-rent developer, how do you see the role of design within the social value space?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. I mean, the core of our business is social value. We're successful because we build successful communities. We've grown at a massive rate because we kind of understand, what makes a really good community. And I think a lot of it is actually less about the design and more about the people. More about the people who are managing those communities. Sorry, I forgot the question there.
No, about the role of design within the social value piece. Obviously, I say as an architect as well as a developer, how are you seeing the design role you play in the decision making you have?
Yeah. So I mean, I think the challenge is always on the policy side, because the policy is just not aligned with what makes a good community. I mean, it can be very, very specific about, a certain example is that, every one of our buildings, we try and have a single entry point or a major primary entry point. And that's where our entire team are based, the leasing team, community managers, concierge. And the reason why we do that is because we want them to have face time with the residents every single day. If they were remote, the only communication they have with the residents is complaints, And so we need them to have face time every day. If you take the London Housing Design Guide, it says that on a mid-rise building, we have to put 4 separate cores, 4 separate entrances, and we can't connect to that main entrance. Yet that's one of the key things that drives the success of the community, is that interaction with our team and the people in the community. And it's also a complete inconvenience for someone who lives here to go down, walk down the street, go up in another lift to amenities. So there are certain things in the guide which are they're very good for the social housing side of things, where you don't have an on-site management team. And some for sale developments where you don't have an on-site management team. But where you have an on-site management team, you're trying to build that sense of community. It's a critical part of it. And we always think of our buildings as not just the building, but the space and the people and the businesses around it. So our teams are always out networking with the businesses and local community groups to, organize events within the building, outside the building. We have a project in Greensford that has an amazing public space that is always activated. There's lots of groups from within the community who can use that space. And we're the catalyst for that. And I think that's the important thing. And for us, that's what makes the community successful. And I love the idea of, how do you measure it? Because I spend a lot of time with our research team talking about what questions can you ask, residents. And the first thing you've got to do is get the question right, because the wrong question can definitely lead to the wrong results. But we have a very simple measure. Would the resident pay more for this, or would they pay less? And then you really get to the crux of what people really care about, And so, if you take something like, there's an obsession with north-facing apartments in London. It's like, anyone who lives in a north-facing apartment is in hell, And I've lived for 15 years in a north-facing apartment, and I love it. And so, if we thought there was a preference against that, we would see it in our rent. We don't see it. We don't see any kind of demand for a particular orientation. In fact, one of the problems we do have is west-facing apartments overheating. And then having to introduce, cooling systems or reduce the window sizes, and then your view gets less, your daylight gets less, or you're putting in overshed. So, what fascinates me is not the overarching kind of principles of things. It's the minute detail that you need to analyze in order to understand what are the sort of key drivers to the success of a community. I always think that design is 90% observation and 10% action.
No, that's a really good answer in regards to actually looking at the fact that we do have a sometimes uncomfortable conversation around social value and commercial value, because some people think the two things can't exist in the same conversation. They can and actually should do, because you cannot understand one without understanding the other.
Absolutely.
So I'm glad you've actually addressed that point, because that is something people generally sort of shy away from. So we've using Slido, so like I mentioned, if you go to slido.com and use the hashtag LRF23, you can submit your questions. We have about sort of 15 minutes left of the session, so I'll go to Slido to take some questions now. And the first question, I'll bring this to you, Debbie, is value a zero-sum game, and does social value reduce financial value? And that's from Chris Wilson.
Oh, good question. I think it's a difficult one, because I think, as we've been sort of talking, the panel's been talking about, how do you put a cost, how do you put that pound sign, against social value, and I think anything through local authorities and through Section 106 SIL and those types of things, there is obviously a value put against that and outputs. But I think one of the things I'd also kind of just like to raise as well within that is how do you know, we've talked a lot about measurement and data and that and the cost, but how it's that longer term measurement. So when a development is finished and you walk away from it, and how do and I'm like you, Wesley, I've been doing this work for a long time, and I still think we haven't cracked breaking that cycle of deprivation, and that's such a huge thing to do. And again, it's that financial investment that goes along with that. You know, regeneration. You know, going back to the old RDA days, the Regional Development Agency days, doing it back then. You know, through you know, the LEPs as well, and also you know, from county level to London level. How do we break that cycle of deprivation? And that's the multi-million, that's the exam question, if you like. And I'm not, you know, as I say, 20, I'm not going to tell you how many years. And I don't think we've got the answer to it. I don't know if that answers the question or not.
I think it does, actually. I think the fact is that, you know, it does, I think, in terms of the question, you know, is value a zero-sum game? Until we actually have a kind of understanding and consistent approach to it, it probably is. And I think that's the thing we're all probably striving for, is that consistency and understanding of, you know, what are we trying to achieve. There's no point having social value without any understanding of the direction of travel of it and what we're trying to achieve by delivering it. Going back to many points made in the panel so far today. Sticking in the measurement space, so James, I'll come to you on this one. This is from Michael Turner. What's your top tip for successfully measuring social value then? You're saying you're collecting this data. You know, what is your top tip for measuring it in terms of, you know, whether it's a large development or a small development? What kind of advice would you give people?
Well, you need to know your audience. This is a very, very retailer's answer to things, by the way. Someone who's worked in digital and kind of in shops and what have you. But it's fundamentally knowing your audience. And there's an audience for everything. Everything in this, and I'm sorry about this, but everything is in a way a product. And okay, it's not quite like that because these are places people live in and what have you, but there is a product element. So for me, it's about understanding that audience. Now, that audience will change as well over time. And in the very early days, you need to know, again, I'm using marketing terminology here, and I apologize for those if it sounds brutal, but it's that kind of target audience. There are groups within there. There are certain groups that are very obvious, and we can find them. There are other groups that are very silent, and you have to go and find them. And that's where the qualitative side comes in. So kind of tips for this. One is definitely know the audience. And then work back from the problem, really. So for me, you know, there's a big old cliche here, which I always subscribe to. You know, if it matters, you measure it. If you measure it, you manage it, right? That's the world of data fundamentally. But you need to know what you're solving for. You need to know what you're measuring for. There's no point in saying collecting absolutely everything and hoping for the best, that in this morass of information that we might then find some answers. One, that gets expensive. Two, there's a lot of stakeholders involved, and it becomes a big old knotty problem. So it's really actually projecting forward and saying, well, what do we want this space to do for us? Starting to think about what are the metrics that we think that we need to measure. Now, some of them you might be able to measure really easily. Stuff that's easy is like footfall and sort of type of demographics that might be using it, because you can do that. That's the quantitative stuff. There'll be other metrics we don't have a solution for just yet. But you work towards this. And I think going back to Debbie's point, there's almost a longitudinal point to this, which I think a lot of us fail on at a great degree. So we get into sort of developments, we get quite excited about who the target audience is, measuring them and what have you, and then we kind of move on to the next one, right? In actual fact, we need that longitudinal view, and it could be going on it should really be going on for decades, let's be honest, it's the life of that product. And that approach needs to be taken. Now, that requires investment, it requires a mindset change. And in our sort of highly transactional world, we kind of get the data, let's answer a question, it's not always there. So I don't know if I'm sort of answering that question particularly well, but there's elements of it that I would certainly start of who we're dealing with, think about those metrics, create yourself a little metrics framework. There's easy stuff, there's middling stuff, there's really hard stuff you can't do yet, but have that in mind and find ways to get there.
Yeah, I think you have answered the question. And for me, you know, I'm being a consultant in the social value space. There's some clients I'm working with that are very advanced with social value. They've been working with the data for years, understand what they're doing and its purposes to them. But there's some clients who are just late to the party, and they're very honest about that, saying, you know, but how do I start measuring all these metrics and everything out here? It's not that. It's about understanding what social value is, starting at a very easy base position, and then evolving and developing and improving that position. So I think you have answered that question there. Taking it back to sort of the more community-led approach to social value and design, so a question for you, Imogen, that's come through from Jasmine from 2 to 3 Degrees, is how are you ensuring the voices of young people are embedded into the design of places and spaces within their community? And we could maybe hear some practical examples and best practices of how you've done that on the projects you've worked on.
I mean, what we see is that difference between quite an extractive process, where you often show people, do you like this one or do you like that one? Perhaps a single workshop, perhaps something like that, as opposed to a much more long-term process, where you actually sit down with young people and you work with them so that they have the tools to talk knowledgeably about public space. So we're just completing a project that we've done with the LSE in Countryside, where we've done 5 projects working with young people, and we take them through a curriculum which talks about what is public space, why is public space important, what are the constraints that people who are designing public space have to work within, and given all of this understanding and knowledge, what is your input into that? And what you end up with is a much richer understanding of what is occurring for young people in a particular local area. Because I think that's also incredibly important, that how young people are experiencing their local area is very geographically local. So the experience of young people in Gravesend or in Hemel Hempstead is very different to the experience of young people in Clapham. And it's far too easy to go, well, I've talked to some young people, and this is what they said, and so I'm going to apply it here. And that's simply not going to work. I think the other thing with young people is to recognise the timescales. Being a teenager, I seem to recall when I did it, lasted a very long time. But in terms of a developer's perspective, that 5 years between being 13 and 18 and going off to college and thinking you're an adult, it's a blink of an eye. And we talk so often about, oh, shall we do this with a meanwhile space? We were working with some young people, and this came up, and everyone's using the term meanwhile space. And this young woman said, I'm really sorry, but that's not a meanwhile space, 3 years, 5 years. She said, that's my teenage years, gone. This isn't meanwhile for me. If you talk about something being in meanwhile space for 5 years, you've basically said my entire teenagerness, well, it's just meanwhile for you, isn't it? So I think it's thinking about those timescales, thinking about the geography. Did that answer the question?
It did, and I find it really interesting, actually, because I spoke to a graffiti artist quite a few years ago, and I remember them doing some amazing work around Bethnal Green and that area, and then they took some photographs of it, and actually these photographs ended up in a built-to-rent building, so they're almost kind of immortalised within this building. But then months later, the graffiti had been graffitied up with some really very low-level tagging by young people, which destroyed this amazing artwork. I spoke to the artist about it, and he just said, graffiti is transient, it's not permanent. And actually, in the same way that some of these spaces are removed, it's about the fact that they come back in other areas for other people and have the same amount, if not better, impact down the line. Because ultimately, you know, Meanwhile is a facilitator, I think, and I've seen it do so many amazing things that have informed how future uses of certain developments have been. And some Meanwhile uses have stayed because actually, they're irreplaceable. And actually, what's been created there has been a culture and a community that is going to add more value to the properties that we're talking about because people want to live in and around these spaces. And I think that's the thing that Meanwhile shouldn't be seen as just short term. It sometimes can be leading to long term, and strategizing for that is quite key. I've got one sort of final question for the panel for you, Yemi. And it's anonymous, so it could be controversial for you, I don't know. We'll see. But, so, you know, how do we work with developers who don't meet social value outcomes and want to provide financial contributions to offset obligations and persuade them to do better? Because I'm sure, obviously, working on the local authority side of things, you know, there are still developers that would just rather sign the cheque than actually do the work.
Yeah. So, for me, and I don't think it's controversial, again, it's about mandating and using contracts. So they're non-negotiables right from the outset. So I think it's really important for those that are procuring projects to really be clear about what they want from the outset and set them in your development agreements, your contracts, and then have to hold developers and your partners accountable for what they've signed up to. So for me, it's as easy as that. Use your contracts right from the beginning and be clear about what you want. and then work with, when there are difficulties, as I said earlier, meeting those obligations, then work collaboratively to ensure that they are met.
We've got a bit more time to go, so can I take some questions from the floor? Does anyone have a question they'd like to ask the panel? Okay, definitely silence. So we'll go to my question and my summary. Look, I feel that this is a conversation that sort of starts and doesn't end, and it won't end anytime soon, to be honest. I think there's so much more that the social value space has to evolve. So what I'll do before I finally sort of sum up the debate today and the discussion is that, I'd invite all the panelists to kind of give like 1 minute final thoughts or views and your own call to action from today's session in terms of what you've heard and what you've learned, and then I'll summarise the session. So, Yemi, let's go first.
I think I've learnt that there's lots of fantastic work going on and there's a willingness, but I still think that we do need to change mindset about social value, what it is, purpose, and again, just the call to action is to continue to remember that people are behind everything that we're doing. People with dreams, people with aspirations, people just like you and I. So that should be the backdrop of all that we seek to do and achieve.
Yeah, thank you. James?
Yeah, I mean, I'd agree with that. I mean, I talk about data, but it is about people. All of the information we collect is all about citizens, consumers, whatever title you have for that person in that place, the user of a space. And I think it's critical to remain, keep people at the centre of all of this. My kind of advice on all of this is just think about what matters from a space, because by understanding, don't start with the data. Start with what, as I said before, start with what matters. What are the kind of impacts we're hoping to see? Some of the impacts that might come from a space are unintended as well, obviously. You can't, serendipity occurs as well. But just think about what matters and then work from there and then start to find your evidence. And the other thing I'd say is, be slightly, and this is as a data guy, be slightly wary of easy solutions. Technology will not solve all of this. Helps us with some of the quantitative stuff. But when it comes to talking to people, that's getting in front of them and sitting down. Technology does not help there, and there's no two ways about it. That is some hard yards, but it needs to happen.
Thank you, James. Imogen?
I agree completely with what Yemi and James have said. I suppose just looking at the screen that we can see in front, design matters, exploring good social value. And I suppose it's all the design professionals in the room using their expertise to listen to what people are saying about what they want to see in spaces, and using that expertise to create those spaces, because people talk about what they want. So we hear teenage girls and young women say, I just want a place where I can hang out and feel kind of safe and feel like I'm not being judged and my mum/dad aren't going to worry about me. Now, that seems a very reasonable thing for them to say. But they are not design experts, and they don't know what that space looks like. And actually, I don't know what that space looks like, because I don't think I've actually seen it yet. But it's a sort of a call to action to all the brilliant design specialists in the room to think, well, actually, I'm going to think about that problem. What would that space look like in reality?
Thank you. Gary?
I think for me, if we want innovation and to be agile and respond to kind of changing living patterns, let's not take guidance and make it policy. I think the clue is in the name, guidance, which is a big thing. And, because it just completely stifles innovation and is always behind the curve. Things are always changing faster than the government can keep up with it. And it's always a responsive thing, trying to control something which is evolving and changing. When I was doing social housing and for sale housing, it always infuriated me that we had to build the separate social housing block and the separate for sale block. And the thing that we did back in 2016, along with a bunch of other build-to-rent providers, was pioneer the discount market rent model. And I think that's one of the biggest changes that has happened in the last few years, and it's growing. You know, we just completed a project in the Netherlands was 50% affordable, and we've launched a new housing brand in the US, which is all privately funded, targeting 80% AMI, 30% rent in all of the different regions. So, you know, for me, that's the thing that makes me kind of excited, is that the entire sort of, that breakdown or that split is now disappearing, you know, and the more we can do that, the better.
Okay. And Debbie, as a CEO of a bid, what do you need to do and what do you want us to do?
Let's just do more. I mean, what I was going to say was, I think whether you're government, business, developers, real estate, whatever you are, I think it's really important is listen to those voices, digest what those voices are saying, and then act on what those voices are saying so that we can evoke change. And wouldn't it be wonderful that at some point we don't have to have panels like this at these type of events, because actually it is the norm and it is part of what we all do.
Brilliant, thank you. And I think that's a good way to sort of round the conversation off, is that, you know, not to have these panels individually would be great, but I think also, you know, I think the words earlier was, what does good look like? And I think we're still trying to work out what social value is to understand what good social value is. So I think ultimately, you know, as long as we're having these conversations and these panels at these kind of events, we're only going to get better, I think. So just want to thank the panel for coming and sharing the last hour with us all. And I'm very much aware it's lunchtime now and people have places to go to eat. So thank you all for attending and enjoy the rest of the conference.